Hello and welcome to the Turkish History Podcast. Episode 70. New Roman Holiday. Before we begin, if you have been enjoying this podcast, I'd like to ask you to please subscribe, rate, and leave a review on Apple Podcasts or wherever you get this podcast. It would mean a lot to me and would help more people find the podcast. Thank you for listening. So last time, we discussed the first reign of Keyhüsrev I, the Roman Sultan, who will really launch the golden age of the Seljuks of Rum. But we also covered the reign of Suleiman II, which, though short, was of great importance. Rukneddin Suleiman Shah had reunited Turkish Anatolia and had indeed expanded the power of Konya further to the east than it had ever reached before. To use the Japanese historical analogy, he had baked the cake. And today, we will discuss how Keyhüsrev I will come to eat that cake. How the once and future Sultan of Rum sought refuge in Constantinople before riding east to retake his throne, just as the Roman Empire suffers one of the greatest catastrophes in its long history. So to begin, we are going to back up a bit and cover the exile of Keyhüsrev I, his holiday in the New Rome. As we mentioned last time, Keyhüsrev was driven out of Konya in 1196 by his half-brother, Suleiman II. Distracted by events in the west, Turkish Anatolia itself had fallen from the Sultan, and his first reign had been, honestly, kind of a disaster. Deposed, the former Sultan had fled not to the west, towards his old homeland on the Byzantine borders, but south and east, through the towering Taurus Mountains and the Cilician Gates, the great passes traversed over 1,000 years earlier by Alexander the Great, and came into Cilicia. And he did not flee alone. He brought with him his son, the next Roman Sultan, Izzeddin Kavus, and came to the court of King Levon, now ruling the Armenian kingdom of Cilicia. However, Levon was loath to antagonize the ascendant Rukneddin Suleiman Shah, and so while he gave Keyhüsrev a personally warm reception, he was not willing to do more for him. As Choniates says, however, Levon absolutely refused to undertake his defense and restore him to his former dominion, contending that he had made peace with Rukneddin, and that such assistance could only lead to bloodshed. So while thankful for Levon's personal warmth and hospitality, Keyhüsrev realized that he could not stay in Cilicia. And so the former Sultan decamped the Armenian kingdom and made for the one place where he was confident that he would be well received, and from where, maybe, he could have a chance of retaking his throne: Constantinople. Now, why Constantinople? Well, most importantly, Constantinople was the imperial city. It was not just wealthy, but indeed powerful. The empire had a long history of backing Turkish pretenders by this point. Indeed, in some Byzantine eyes, all of Anatolia was actually Roman territory delegated to the Turkish savages, and as such, an area where the empire had a natural interest and might back a rival to the Sultan in Konya. Now, this was always going to be dependent on which way the winds were blowing, and it was far from certain, but it was conceivable that Constantinople might one day provide Keyhüsrev with the funds and the military to retake his throne. Furthermore, remember that Keyhüsrev was half Greek on his mother's side. He therefore spoke Greek with native-level fluency. It was also likely that his mother was a Greek noblewoman of some sort, meaning that Keyhüsrev probably had at least some well-connected family members in the New Rome. But more importantly, on an immediate level, Isaac Angelos had been deposed in 1195. Keyhüsrev had, of course, been a massive thorn in Emperor Isaac's backside, constantly backing Roman pretenders in western Anatolia as well as the Bey of Ankara, Muhyiddin Mesud, who had gone to war with the empire in northern Anatolia. Isaac Angelos would have been unlikely to greet the arrival of Keyhüsrev enthusiastically, but Isaac's troubled reign, at least his first reign, came to an end when his elder brother Alexios arrested, imprisoned, and blinded him in March 1195. Keyhüsrev was deposed for his part in summer 1196, meaning that the two men had not had time to really develop an antagonistic relationship. And from the new emperor's perspective, having a pretender to the throne in Konya kicking around actually made a lot of sense. Who knew? Maybe the opportunity would arise for this half-Greek, half-Turkish former Sultan of Rome to be an asset to the Roman Empire. Now, the timing of Keyhüsrev's arrival in the Queen of Cities is a bit hard to nail down. Choniates implies that Keyhüsrev arrived in the imperial city in 1199, meaning that ultimately Keyhüsrev's Roman holiday would last for about 5 years. However, most scholars think that this is incorrect, and that Keyhüsrev probably arrived sometime in 1197, which would put his Roman holiday at around 7 years. Regardless, it seems that while he was not initially treated overly warmly, despite his noble blood and his status as the former sultan, he was nevertheless still put on the imperial bankroll and was given a pension and a residence. However, Keyhüsrev seems to have been a very good Byzantine courtier, because within a couple of years he dramatically improved his standing within the imperial court. The Seljuk-name, written by Ibn Bibi, provides us with an interesting anecdote of how this happened, though it must be taken with a massive, heaping tablespoon of salt. According to Ibn Bibi, shortly after his arrival in Constantinople, Keyhüsrev engaged in a great debate with a Frank, that is, a Western European, a Latin, in the court of the emperor. This descended into an argument and then a fight, basically a medieval joust, in which the Sultan of Rome wielded a spear to defend the honor and the rights of the Roman emperor. This, of course, resulted in a victory for the Sultan, and the Sultan being embraced by the imperial family and the court. And who knows? Though incidents like these in medieval sources are routinely invented and should be treated with great skepticism, they can still turn out to be true, or at least contain a kernel of truth. And I would also point out that it is very interesting to note that here, Ibn Bibi is presenting the Sultan as being on the side of the Greeks against the Latins, knowing, as he does, that a great and devastating conflict between the Greeks and the Latins was even now fast approaching. Regardless of how he actually did it, Keyhüsrev was able to quickly move up through the Byzantine court social world. The most telling sign of this is that at some point in the late 1190s or more likely the early 1200s, that is still relatively early into his stay, Keyhüsrev married a Byzantine aristocrat. And not just any aristocrat, but a member of the very highest circle of Byzantine noble families. Keyhüsrev married a woman whose name has come down to us in the Turkish sources as Daulat Razia Khatun. Razia, as I will call her, was the daughter of a man who will be with us for some episodes to come, a man named Manuel Komnenos Morozomes. That's right, a man who was effectively a member of our old friends and wearers of the imperial purple, the Komnenoi. Morozomes appears to have married an illegitimate but recognized daughter of the late Emperor Manuel Komnenos, thus making Razia a member of the extended Komnenian house. Marriage into this highest circle of interrelated and feuding clans that formed the Roman ruling elite was an honor that had never been extended to a Roman Sultan before. Now, that's not to say that Greek women had never been married to Turks, far from it. Indeed, Keyhüsrev himself was the product of such a union. But never before had it been a woman of such an elevated social rank. Not a commoner, not even just a noblewoman, but a member of the inner circle that really ran the empire. Think of the families like the Ducai, the Vatatzes, the Komnenoi, the Angeloi, and so on. Indeed, the granddaughter of an emperor herself, a descendant of the great Alexios even. Now this was, of course, greatly controversial at the time, as it basically meant marrying a Byzantine princess to an infidel. To get around this uncomfortable reality, some sources say that Keyhüsrev converted to Christianity during his time at the capital, but this is not found in the earlier primary sources, and it does seem a little bit unlikely. Converting to Christianity would mean that Keyhüsrev was abandoning his claim to the throne in Konya, something he never seems to have contemplated. However, we cannot rule out the possibility. Maybe Keyhüsrev really had truly given up on his claim to the Sultanate and was now contemplating living the rest of his life here, in the New Rome, among his mother's people. Maybe he really did make the jump across the religious divide. He would not have been the first or the last Turk to do so, of course. A jump that, if made, would mean that he later jumped back to Islam. Again, not the first or the last Turk to do that either. Razia soon gave birth to a son in Constantinople, who Keyhüsrev named Alaeddin Keykubad. As with the name of his elder son Keykavus, who had come with him into exile and was with him now in Constantinople, and as with his own name Keyhüsrev, the name Keykubad was the name of a great Shah of Iran from the Shahnameh. Father and the two sons shared names with the Shahs from the mythical Kayanian dynasty, which the Shahnameh claims ruled Iran before the Sassanids. And this son, in the future, will reign as the Sultan of Rum, presiding over the zenith of the golden age of the Seljuks of Rum, and he will go down in history as Keykubad the Great. And the fact that Keykubad the Great's mother, Razia, was Greek means that Alaeddin Keykubad was in fact 3/4 Greek, given that his father was half Greek and his mother was entirely Greek. And the fact that Razia was also a member of the Komnenian house further means that Keykubad the Great and his descendants were also descendants of our old Roman imperial friends, Manuel Komnenos, John Komnenos, and even the great Alexios. Thus, the blood of the Roman emperors would come to flow through the veins of the Roman sultans. Keykubad the Great, the future Turkish Sultan of Rum, was thus born in the imperial city of Constantinople, a descendant of both Seljuk and Alexios Komnenos, and bore the name of a mythical Iranian Shah, coupled with an Arabic name meaning the summit of the faith. And to me, this makes Keykubat the Great, even at the moment of his birth, an embodiment of the different strands that weave together to create the many-colored and tangled tapestry that is Turkish history. With his wife Razia and his sons Keykavus and Keykubad by his side, Keyhüsrev thus settled into a comfortable life in the Byzantine court. The former Roman Sultan, a retainer of the Emperor of the Romans, and appearing to all as a Greek aristocrat, albeit one with a funny name and who likely, though not certainly, remained a Muslim. Now, of course, I think that it is certain that Keyhüsrev's own Greek ancestry and his fluency in the Greek language were a major part of his ability to adapt to life in Constantinople and play Roman politics so well. But I think that this ability to work within the Greek language and culture and the Byzantine system was not just a one-way street. That is, it was more than just a way for Keyhüsrev to implant himself in the Byzantine court. Keyhüsrev seems to have kept the dream of returning to Konya, of retaking his throne, and while in the Byzantine capital, he would have gained an insight into how the Roman state functioned. This perspective would have been brand new in the Seljuk system. Never before had a Roman Sultan spent this much time in the New Rome, and never before had a Roman Sultan had the linguistic and cultural ability to truly interact with Byzantium in this way. Keyhüsrev would have seen the centralized political system of the Roman Empire up close, and he also would have seen the failures of the imperial court to impose its will on the peripheries, to truly master this centralized system. See, Alexios III Angelos' reign was a total disaster, and a major part of this was caused by the emperor giving concessions to local officials holding estates termed pronoia. Now, the pronoia were very similar to the ikta that we are more familiar with, being basically tax rights or streams of state revenue given to local administrators and soldiers. As a side note, in time, the Byzantine pronoia will be basically taken over by the Ottomans, who will then combine the pronoia with the classic Islamic ikta system to create the Ottoman timar system. The timar system, as an inheritor of both the Byzantine pronoia and the Islamic ikta, will continue down until the 18th century, with elements existing in some Ottoman provinces until the Ottoman administrative reforms of the 19th century. But for now, back to our story. In the late 1190s and early 1200s, Alexios' concessions to these men, the pronoia holders, did nothing but loosen imperial control over them, and ultimately it led to revolt. And this wasn't all that was happening. The troubled reign of Alexios III Angelos was defined by a weak emperor and a weak imperial court, which would shortly end in a complete catastrophe. And Keyhüsrev would have been there in the imperial city to see this troubled reign of Alexios III up close. And he would shortly be back on the throne in Konya to witness its consequences. These events must have had a profound impact on Keyhüsrev's reign and on the golden age that it would launch. See, I think that it is not an accident that Keyhüsrev's second reign will really mark the beginning of a change in the Seljuk state, a new stage in the development of the Sultanate of Rum. If we step back and look at the development of the Seljuk Sultanate of Rum, we can see two clear stages of political development that have already occurred. In stage 1, small beyliks emerged across Anatolia, the Sultanate, indeed, being just one of these itself. These emerging beyliks were bottom-up affairs, joint projects of Byzantine elites and newly arrived Turks, with the Turks stepping into the role formerly played by the now gone Roman military. These small beyliks were then integrated into the growing Seljuk state, with the Seljuk dynasty using the legitimacy provided by its blue blood and its status as Ghazi leaders of the Great Jihad to exert control over the smaller beyliks and the wild tribes who continued to roam the land. Then there was Stage 2, beginning in Mesud's reign, but really taking off during the reign of Kılıç Arslan II. In this stage, we see the out-and-out conquest of the Anatolian beyliks, even the largest among them, and the installation of Seljuk princes in their place. The Seljuk state, basically conquering Anatolia and creating appanages or satrapies to be ruled by members of the ruling family. In many ways, Sultan Rukneddin Süleyman Shah's conquest of the Seljukids and the installation of his half-brother Tuhrol Shah in Erzurum was the last act of this stage. But then, of course, Süleyman II died, leaving it to Keyhüsrev to really launch the next stage of Seljuk political development. And in this stage 3, the court in Konya is going to basically take over all of these satrapies and appanages and beyliks directly. The rule of Seljuk princes over the satrapies set up across Anatolia, begun all the way back during the days of Mesud, will come to an end, with a couple of exceptions on the fringes of the Sultanate. Now, the reign of Süleyman II was in fact sort of a transitional stage, because he both performed the last act of Stage 2, and he sort of inaugurated the new Stage 3 with his destruction of the other Seljuk princes in his conquests. But it will really be Keyhüsrev who will consolidate this new stage of the Seljuk state. Power will come to be centralized in Konya itself, as the Seljuk Sultan of Rum becomes not just the overlord of Turkish Anatolia, but really its direct administrator. The court in Konya will come to directly rule the Sultanate and all of Turkish Anatolia, in many ways a sort of even more centralized Anatolian version of Al-Dawla al-Nizamiya. And just as with Al-Dawla al-Nizamiya, naturally, this will lead to further tensions between this centralizing court and the wild tribes. Tensions that will boil over, particularly when new tribes come flooding into Anatolia, as new and mighty steppe riders appear from the east. But we will get there eventually. Now, this process of political development has been going on for a while now. Its immediate origin lay in the conquests of Süleyman II that we discussed last time. The unification of Anatolia under Konya was a prerequisite for the coming centralization of the state. But the process actually had even deeper roots. The very beginnings of the centralized court apparatus in Konya went all the way back to the reign of Mesud, and even, in some ways, Kılıç Arslan I. However, it will be Keyhüsrev who really ties all of this together. And I think that this drive for centralization, which will really come into its own during the second reign of Keyhüsrev, and which will be completed by his sons, was in part influenced by the time that Keyhüsrev spent in Constantinople. In the up-close view he got of the imperial institutions of the Roman Empire, and the problems he saw as those institutions proved to be incapable of controlling the marcher lords and vassals of the empire on the frontiers. So that was what Keyhüsrev got up to as the reign of Süleyman II progressed for 7 long years. While Süleyman II conquered Anatolia and went to war with Georgia, Keyhüsrev sat in Constantinople, watching the Roman Empire descend into a perilous state and waiting for his chance to return to power. Perhaps even despairing and giving up on that chance, and formally joining the faith of his mother. But ultimately, Keyhüsrev got a chance to return to power in 1204. Coincidentally, just as the Roman Empire stood on the very edge of destruction. As we covered last time, Suleiman II fell ill and died shortly after defeating Muhyiddin Mesud in Ankara in early 1204, and thus completing the reunification of Turkish Anatolia. The Sultan's body was carried back to Konya, and soon his son, Kılıç Arslan III, proclaimed himself to be the next Roman Sultan. But remember the Turkish rules of succession. Any member of the ruling family has a claim to the throne if he can win it, and the state is divisible among the claimants. In short, the crown goes to the strongest. And there was a certain former Roman Sultan kicking his heels in the new Rome who was just not going to let this opportunity pass him by. Now, the reign of the third Sword Lion is going to last nowhere near as long as those of his illustrious namesakes. Indeed, he's barely going to make it a year, and the basic reason was that Kılıç Arslan III was a young man. We know he had fathered a daughter, meaning that he was not a child, but likely he was in his late teens or at most early 20s. And remember, his father Suleiman had only just conquered Turkish Anatolia. This meant that the state in Konya was not really in a stable and solid place, and there was a lot of nervousness among the courtiers and officials scurrying around Konya in the aftermath of Suleiman's death. Basically, immediately upon the death of Suleiman, there were whispers that maybe this unseasoned young man wasn't really cut out for this. These fears were confirmed extremely early in his reign, as perhaps predictably, the court faced unrest among the Turkmen. Either dissatisfied with the reign of a young and unsteady man, or else deciding that they could profit from the uncertainty, 3 descendants of our old friend Ya'ab Asan, the last Danishmand Bey, organized some sort of tribal uprising or resistance of the eastern tribes. The old story we've seen over and over again in Seljuk history, the conflict between the court and the tribes. This thoroughly spooked certain members of the court, beys, emirs, viziers, and so on, and they became convinced that they needed a strong and experienced ruler. Someone who could hold together the oh-so-recently won conquests of the late Suleiman II. And this faction turned to the Danishmand Beys, now leading the Turkmen, and began talking about maybe bringing back the former Sultan, currently kicking his heels in western Anatolia, to see if maybe this would placate the tribes. However, this was not a uniform opinion. Indeed, not even a majority opinion in Konya itself. In particular, the more conservative members of the court, especially the religious establishment, it appears, were opposed to bringing back Keyhüsrev. The reason, of course, was that the Sultan was half Greek and therefore the son of an infidel woman. Furthermore, he was married to a Greek noblewoman, herself an infidel, and his children had been raised for years among the infidels. These people darkly muttered, "Who knows what infidel customs and beliefs this half-infidel has picked up from his mother and his wife's people during their long holiday among the unbelievers? Maybe he has even converted to the faith of the heretical Greeks." Therefore, these conservatives instead rallied to Kılıç Arslan III, opposing the return of Keyhüsrev. However, the Danishmand tribal leaders and the minority faction at court supporting Keyhüsrev came together, and in either late 1204 or early 1205, they dispatched a Turkish noble named Hajib Zekeriya to the west to summon the once and future Roman Sultan to return to Konya and reclaim his throne. As a side note, the Seljuk Name says that one of the reasons for Hajib Zekeriya's appointment was that he spoke the 5 languages of the country of the Romans. Likely Greek, Turkish, Armenian, Persian, the prestige language of culture and government, and Arabic, the prestige language of religion. A telling sign of the fluid multicultural and multilinguistic makeup of Anatolia at this time. Now, for reasons that we will get into in detail next time, Keyhüsrev was not in Constantinople at this point. He was instead in an unfortunately unidentified fortress somewhere in western Anatolia, holed up there with his wife Razia, his sons, including Keyhüsrev and Keyhüsrev, the future sultans of Rum, and his father-in-law Manuel Morozomes. The family, and indeed all of Byzantium, were in dire straits and traumatized, having suffered through one of the greatest catastrophes in the long history of the Roman Empire. A catastrophe that we will get into next time. And in the aftermath of this great disaster, Morozomes had set himself up as a ruler of a sort in this unnamed fortress in western Anatolia. According to the Seljuk Name, Hajib Zekeriya arrived at this remote fortress in western Anatolia and pleaded with Keyhüsrev to reclaim the throne in Konya. Zekeriya reportedly delivered his appeal as the once and future Sultan of Rum watched his sons playing in the garden. That is, the future sultans Izzeddin Keyhüsrev and Alaeddin Keykubat the Great. After much recitation of lines of the Quran and Arabic and Persian poetry, the Seljuk Name is of course full of people communicating like that, Keyhüsrev dismissed Hajib Zekeriya. Then Keyhüsrev summoned his father-in-law, Manuel Morozomes, to discuss the proposal. No doubt, the two men talked about the perilous state of the Roman Empire and what future could possibly await their family in its ruins. Certainly, Morozomes discussed the aid that his son-in-law could potentially provide him as Sultan, as he tried to navigate the shell-shocked politics of the shattered remnants of the Roman Empire. If he had indeed converted to Christianity, Keyhüsrev certainly pondered what it might mean to return to Islam. This discussion among the family continued for 3 days, until finally, on the 4th day, the former Roman Sultan summoned Hajib Zekeriya and informed him that yes, he would accept the proposal and he would return to Konya to reclaim his throne. Keyhüsrev, his wife Razia, his sons Keyhüsrev and Keykubat, and his father-in-law Manuel Morozomes thus gathered up the wealth that they had managed to smuggle out of Constantinople and whatever Roman troops they had at their disposal, and began racing towards Konya. Reportedly, on the ride to Konya, the current Roman emperor in Iznik, what we call the Nicene emperor, Theodore Lascaris, tried to stop this advance of Keyhüsrev and his family. Now, we will eventually get into who Theodore Lascaris was and why he was in Iznik, but this is an interesting detail, as it implies firstly that the Nicene emperor had come to a deal with Kulich Arslan III, and further, because it implies that Keyhüsrev and his family were originally located somewhere west or north of Iznik. As some sources imply that they were on some sort of island, perhaps they had been holed up somewhere on the coasts of the Sea of Marmara, just across the waters from the Queen of Cities. And it turns out that this dispute over Keyhüsrev's passage to Konya would set the stage for what would be a bitter and bloody struggle between the Nicene emperor and the Roman Sultan. Now, Theodore Lascaris and Keyhüsrev certainly knew each other personally from the Sultan's time in Constantinople. Indeed, Lascaris had married a daughter of Alexios III Angelos, meaning both men were married into the tight-knit and intermarried Byzantine ruling clique. Maybe their coming enmity had its roots in personal disputes and rivalries within that now lost world. We just can't know. But regardless, even this early on into their respective reigns, Theodore Lascaris and Keyhüsrev were already on the road that would lead to war. However, despite this interference by the Nicaean emperor, and potentially even after being briefly detained, Keyhüsrev was ultimately able to evade the clutches of Theodore Lascaris. After yet more Quran and poetry reciting, according to the Seljuk-name, he and his party managed to break out of Iznik and its environs and finally made it onto the Anatolian plateau. News soon arrived in Konya that the former Sultan of Rum was on the move and was preparing to link up with his Turkmen supporters and march on the capital. Now, in Konya, it appears that the population was not extremely enthused by the return of Keyhüsrev. The Seljuk-name, for example, says, "Upon hearing of the news of the approach of the Sultan, the population decided to oppose him because of their love for Kılıç Arslan and fidelity to Rukneddin Süleyman Shah." And this is telling. Remember that the author of the Seljuk-name, Ibn Bibi, was patronized by the descendants of Keyhüsrev, and basically wants to make Keyhüsrev look amazing all of the time. So the fact that even he is forced to admit that there was opposition to the return of the former Sultan is extremely telling. Furthermore, as mentioned earlier, it is clear from the Seljuk-name and other sources that Keyhüsrev faced substantial opposition because of his half-Greek ancestry. Remember, not only was Keyhüsrev half-Greek and a native speaker of Greek, he had married a Greek woman and had just spent many years living among the infidels. No doubt, there were rumors that he had potentially even converted to Christianity. All of this made the religious conservatives more than just nervous. There was a real feeling that this former sultan may have in fact turned infidel. And even if he's not an infidel, he's extremely close to being one. However, the feelings of the citizens of Konya and the religious hardliners couldn't really stop the advance of the former sultan, and Keyhüsrev was soon at the walls of Konya. He had with him a Turkish army provided by those beys and tribes who had summoned him, and his own Greek troops brought from the west and commanded by his father-in-law Manuel Morozomes. Thus, the former sultan surrounded the walls of his former capital and put Konya to siege. The Seljuk-name says of the army brought to the walls of Konya, "If that army of iron had struck time, it would have halted its days and nights." And it appears that this force was so overwhelming that Kılıç Arslan III despaired of withstanding it. Reportedly, the young sultan said, "I know that my uncle seeks revenge and the seizure of my men and property. I believe that he will resort to any means to achieve this. Therefore, do not risk the lives of your family needlessly. Do your best to save yourselves. If my life is spared, it will be an invaluable blessing and an unattainable prize." Now, the Seljuk-name doesn't really dwell on the details here, and, as before, comes up with a face-saving fiction whereby Kılıç Arslan III basically yields to his uncle and transfers power willingly and non-violently to Keyhüsrev. However, the reality was, of course, a tad bit bloodier. It seems that when it became clear that there was no way to resist the army supporting Keyhüsrev and surrounding the walls of Konya, a clique within the besieged capital betrayed Kılıç Arslan III and surrendered the city. Keyhüsrev thus entered Konya in triumph in summer 1205. Kılıç Arslan III, the young sultan and the son of Rukneddin Süleyman Shah, was swiftly deposed. Keyhüsrev was quick to distribute the proceeds of victory to his family. His father-in-law, Manuel Morozomez, was raised to a high office in the Seljuk court. Soon, he would be traveling back to Phrygia to establish his own Byzantine principality under Seljuk patronage. The future sultans, Keykubat and Keykubat, were given Malatya and the former Danishmend homeland around Sivas respectively. Likely, though, they personally stayed in Konya for the time being, or, if actually sent to their new fiefs now, they were under the protection and tutelage of Atabeys, who would actually rule on their behalf. The tribes and the Danishmend beys who had helped Keyhüsrev return to the throne were likewise rewarded. And for his part, Kılıç Arslan III was packed off to a small castle on the outskirts of Konya named Gevale. And I think it will surprise no one to learn that he is not long for this world. Within months, at most, he had been strangled with a bowstring, and Keyhüsrev stood uncontested as the once and current Roman Sultan. Thus began the second reign of Keyhüsrev. But before we dive into the events of his second reign and the golden age that he will launch, we need to back up a bit. Because just before Keyhüsrev seized the throne in Konya, a disaster of monumental proportions had befallen the empire from which he had fled. So next time, we will discuss one of the greatest catastrophes in the long history of the Roman Empire. A disaster that will bring the Roman Empire to the very edge of destruction, and also profoundly alter the course of Turkish history forever. The very fall of the invincible city of Constantinople itself.